I have been a barrister for 31 years. I have stood in courts where fortunes changed hands and men wept openly into their sleeves. I have drawn up contracts that made dukes and broke them. I have seen the worst of what money can do to a human face. The narrowing of the eyes, the hardening of the jaw, that particular stillness that comes over a man when he realizes the law is on the other side. I have never, in all of those 31 years, seen anything like what happened at the Ashford Grange auction. I should begin with what I knew of Caspian Vane, the Duke of Thornwall, before that morning in September, because what I knew is what everyone knew, and what everyone knew was shaped almost entirely by fear. He had inherited the dukedom at 23 when his father and elder brother were taken in the same winter fever. He had inherited not only the title, but the debts his father had accumulated across 2 decades of willful extravagance, and he had paid every one of them within 4 years, not by selling, not by borrowing, but by managing Thornwall's estates with a discipline that made his tenants nervous and his creditors reluctantly respectful. He was not cruel to the people who worked his land. He was not given to fits of temper or to the kind of theatrical coldness that some men of his station cultivated like an ornament. He simply did what was necessary. He did it without sentiment and without explanation, and those 2 qualities, combined with the bluntness of his address and the habit he had of looking at a man as though he could read the arithmetic of his soul directly behind his eyes, had produced in the county of Dowager a reputation that was, if not quite feared, then carefully respected in the way one respects a cliff edge. I had been his solicitor since the beginning. I had sat across from him in my office in Carvenwick when he was 23 and newly titled and newly drowning, and I had laid out the accounts without softening them, because I could see already that softening things for this man would be both useless and insulting. He had looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he had looked at me and said, "What do we need to do? Not what can we do? Not is there any hope? Just what do we need to do?" I had told him. He had done it. That was the man I knew. Precise, thorough, driven by something I could only call a code, an internal set of rules about what was owed and to whom and in what manner, which had nothing to do with sentiment but everything to do with honor. He did not care about opinion. He cared about what was right according to his own reckoning, which was not always the same thing as what was right according to the county's reckoning, and when those 2 things diverged, he chose his own without a flicker of hesitation. I had never seen him in the presence of a woman who interested him. I had never thought to look for it. He had been, for the 15 years of his dukedom, a man of professional preoccupations and private self-sufficiency, and I had not observed any sign that this arrangement was insufficient. He seemed to have concluded, somewhere along the way, that attachment was a luxury he could not afford and had organized his life accordingly. I was to find out how wrong I had been, not about the man, but about the category of things that can come along and overturn an arrangement that seemed perfectly settled. On the 14th of September, in the year of our narrative, I arrived at Ashford Grange at 9:30 in the morning to serve in my official capacity as the presiding barrister over the forced sale of the estate. The sale had been arranged by a consortium of 4 creditors, Messrs. Halkett, Prout, Carver, and Sir Fenwick Loam, who had held paper against the late Reginald Ashford's various debts for some years, and who had, with the patience of men who enjoy the slow inevitability of the law, waited until Mrs. Ashford's options were exhausted before calling them in simultaneously. It was not the most generous thing I had ever witnessed. Reginald Ashford had been a man of charm and very little substance, and his wife had spent the years of his decline quietly managing what could be managed and quietly enduring what could not. She had held the estate together through 5 years of diminishing means and increasingly difficult circumstances, making arrangements with suppliers, negotiating extensions with smaller creditors, managing the tenant relationships with the care of someone who knew that people's livelihoods depended on it. The consortium creditors knew this. They did not particularly care. The estate was worth considerably more than the debts, and the difference, once costs were taken, would revert to them in proportion to their holdings, leaving Mrs. Ashford with a very small sum and no home. "Settle her debts and be done with her," I had heard Halkett say to Prout in the carriage outside, not troubling to lower his voice. "She's held on long enough. The land is what matters." I walked up the drive of Ashford Grange alone and thought about how the law, which I had served faithfully for 3 decades, was on that morning being used for something I did not admire. The house was old and needed work, and had the particular quality of a place that has been loved carefully for a very long time by someone with limited means. The steps were swept, the brass polished, and the garden, though small and not fashionable, had been planted with the kind of deliberate attention that suggested the person tending it knew exactly what they were doing. There were late roses still, dark red ones against the stone wall, the last flowers of a careful summer. Someone had put time into those roses, and that time showed in the way careful attention always does, not in any single detail, but in the overall quality of a thing that has been looked after rather than merely left. Mrs. Willa Ashford received me in the entrance hall. I had been told very little about her. Halkett had mentioned a widow, youngish, no children, no family of consequence. The kind of woman who appears in legal documents as a name attached to a problem. I was not prepared for the person who walked toward me across that hall, not because of any particular beauty, though she was certainly a handsome woman, with dark eyes and a quality of stillness about her face that suggested she had been spending time with difficult things and had made her peace with them, but because of the way she moved. Composed. Not brittle composed, not the performance of composure that women of limited options sometimes mount against the world. Actually composed, from somewhere inside herself that the law and the creditors and the fact of this morning had not reached. She shook my hand. She said, "Mr. Hale, thank you for coming. Shall we proceed?" She did not thank me for the cruelty I was about to enact on behalf of others. She did not ask me if anything could be done, which would have been useless, and which she apparently already knew was useless, which indicated that she understood the law as well as I did. She offered me tea, which I declined, and she walked me through to the drawing room where the 4 creditors were already arranged on her furniture like men who had already measured the room for their own purposes. Sir Fenwick Loam smiled at her. It was the kind of smile that men give women in desperate circumstances when they want to appear gracious without actually being so. He was a broad, florid man of 50-something who had done well for himself in commerce, and had translated that doing well into a local social standing that he protected with the specific vigilance of someone who suspects it could be taken back. He had the manner of a man who had concluded that his success proved something about his character, rather than something about his fortune and the circumstances into which he had been born. Mrs. Ashford gave him a look that could have stripped paint and sat down with her hands folded in her lap, as though she were chairing a committee of people she had decided not to find particularly impressive. I opened the proceedings. I am compressing what followed. The legal portions of forced sales are rarely interesting and often deeply dispiriting, and this one was both. The estate was inventoried, room by room and acre by acre, with the detached thoroughness of men who view a house as a series of columns in a ledger. The debts were read aloud, in full, in the order in which they had been called. Mrs. Ashford sat through the reading of her husband's extravagances, the gambling debts in particular, which were considerable, the unpaid suppliers going back 3 years, the loans taken against the property itself, signed in Reginald Ashford's hand, which had purchased things that were now gone, without any expression I could read, which impressed me considerably, because the numbers were worse than I had understood them to be, and the picture they painted of the late Reginald Ashford was not a flattering one. He had been, so far as the accounts suggested, a man who spent money in the way that certain men spend it, not from greed exactly, but from the specific thoughtlessness of someone who has never had to think very carefully about where money comes from, who relies, perhaps without quite knowing he relies, on the quiet person beside him to manage the consequences. Mrs. Ashford had been managing the consequences for 5 years. The account records made this visible in the way that account records always do, in the gaps, in the items marked paid by Mrs. A's hand, and dated to periods when Reginald Ashford's own entries had gone silent. In the small private loans she had made from what I later understood was an inheritance from her own mother, now nearly exhausted. At the conclusion of the reading, the 4 creditors conferred briefly among themselves, with the air of men completing a formality rather than making a decision, and produced a figure. The estate would satisfy the debt with a margin of approximately £300, which they proposed to split 4 ways as costs, leaving Mrs. Ashford with nothing material. The house in which she had lived and worked for 12 years of marriage would belong to whomever the creditors chose to sell it to. This was legal. It was not, in any meaningful sense, right. Mrs. Ashford said in a voice entirely without trembling, "I see, and the timeline for vacating." "You'll need to be out before the month is done," Halkett said. He at least had the decency to look at the floor while he said it. She nodded once, a single composed movement. She was about to say something, I have no idea what, because I will never know what she had decided to say in that moment, having thought it through, having chosen the words that would be both accurate and dignified, when the door of the drawing room opened. Caspian Vane, the Duke of Thornwall, walked in without knocking. I will admit that I had not known he was coming. He had sent no word. He appeared in that doorway in his riding coat, hat still in his hand, with the look of a man who has ridden some distance and arrived with a purpose, and the change that went over the room was immediate and physical. The kind of change that happens when the largest thing in a landscape shifts and everything else has to recalibrate its position. Sir Fenwick Loam actually stood up. He did it before he seemed to realize he was doing it, the way men do in the presence of someone whose authority they have already registered in some part of the body that acts faster than the mind. Halkett straightened in his chair. Prout cleared his throat. The fourth creditor, Carver, no relation to the pleasant spaniel-raising Mrs. Carver, whom I shall mention later, found something in his papers to examine with sudden concentration. The Duke of Thornwall looked at the room. He looked at the creditors, at me, at the papers on the table, and then last at Mrs. Ashford. He held her gaze for a moment that I found myself counting without meaning to, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, and in those seconds something passed between them that I could not have named except to say that it was a recognition. He saw her. All of her, the composure that was real, the hands folded in her lap, the set of her shoulders that held its line despite everything, the dark eyes that returned his gaze without flinching, and he understood what he was looking at. Then he said, "What is the sum?" It was not a question. It was stated with the particular flatness of a man who has already decided to pay and wants the number so he can be done with this part of it. I told him. He didn't blink. "I'll pay it," he said. "The estate stays with Mrs. Ashford. The debts are settled today." The silence that followed was of the thick, specific variety that occurs when 4 men who have been relying on a certainty find it has just been removed from beneath them with no warning and no apparent recourse. Sir Fenwick Loam said, with the particular tone of a man trying to regain territory, "Your Grace, I'm not sure you fully understand the legal." "I understand the sum," the Duke said. "Do you accept payment or not?" There was a pause in which Loam looked at the Duke of Thornwall and apparently performed a rapid calculation about the various costs and benefits of continuing to object, and found the benefits insufficient to justify the experience of the Duke's gaze remaining on him at its current level of attention. They accepted payment. I watched Mrs. Ashford during this. Her hands were still folded in her lap. She was looking at the Duke of Thornwall with an expression I could not immediately name, not gratitude, or not only gratitude, though gratitude was certainly there. Something more complicated. Something that had been very still a moment ago and was now moving very carefully behind her eyes, like a current deep in water that barely disturbs the surface. The creditors filed out with somewhat less dignity than they had filed in. I lingered only long enough to begin the necessary initial paperwork, and in doing so I found myself a witness to the first real conversation between Caspian Vane and Willa Ashford. I was at the small desk in the corner going through forms. They were both aware of me and unconcerned by me, which I took as a compliment of a particular kind. She said, when the others were gone and the sound of carriages in the drive had faded, "I did not send for you, Your Grace." "No," he agreed. "Why did you come?" He looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who did not hurry his answers, which some people found arrogant and which I had always found to be one of the more genuinely honest things about him. He was waiting until he had something accurate to say. He said, "Because I knew what they were doing and I had the means to prevent it." "And what do you want in return?" The question was not rude. It was direct and practical, and it was the question of a woman who has learned not to accept gifts without understanding their cost. I respected her enormously for asking it, and I noted that the Duke respected her for it too. I saw him register the question and find it appropriate rather than impertinent. "Nothing," he said, "for now nothing." She held his gaze with the same steadiness he was giving her. She said, "That is not actually an answer." He almost smiled. I saw it, the very edge of it, at the corner of his mouth before it was brought back into the gravity that was his habitual expression. He said, "No, I suppose it isn't." He left shortly after, with the arrangements to my office for transfer of the funds, and I spent another hour and a half completing the paperwork. When I finally looked up, Mrs. Ashford was standing at the window of her drawing room, looking out at the late roses against the wall, with an expression that was, I thought, the face of someone trying to understand the dimensions of the thing that had just happened, to take its measure, as she would take the measure of anything, carefully and without excessive feeling. I did not know then that I was going to spend the next 4 months watching these two people learn each other. I did not know that I was going to be, through the accident of professional proximity and genuine affection for both of them, the closest witness to something that changed them both in ways neither of them had anticipated. I only knew, driving back to Carvenwick that afternoon, that the Duke of Thornwall had done something completely out of keeping with his reputation, and that Mrs. Ashford was a woman I would not be surprised to find myself thinking about. I thought about her quite a lot in the weeks that followed, and I was not the only one. The Duke sent a letter the next day. Mrs. Ashford told me this when I came to finalize the documents. She had the letter in her hand, and she read me the relevant portion with the careful neutrality of a woman reading a legal document rather than a personal communication, which told me something about how seriously she was thinking about it. The relevant portion was this: the Duke of Thornwall, having settled the debts on Ashford Grange, wished to propose an arrangement. He required someone with detailed knowledge of the county's eastern estates to assist his steward in a survey he was conducting over the next several months. Mrs. Ashford, having managed Ashford Grange through some difficult years, had precisely the knowledge of local tenancy and land management this survey required. He was prepared to offer a fee that would, as he put it in the measured language of his letter, make the restoration work at Ashford Grange considerably more comfortable to undertake. She set the letter down on the table and looked at me with those dark, steady eyes. "Is this what I think it is? What do you think it is?" "I think it is a man who has just saved my estate, finding a way to pay me for the saving of it, so that I am not left in his debt." I considered that for a moment. "Yes," I said, "I think that's probably right." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter. Then she said, "He is either very kind or very calculating." "I have known him for 8 years," I said. "In my experience, he is both in roughly equal measure, and in his case the two things serve each other rather well." "That sounds," she said, "like a complicated man." "He is not complicated," I said. "He has a code. Men with genuine codes are actually very simple once you understand the code. The complication belongs to people who have no code and must invent their reasons as they go." She looked at the letter again. She turned it in her hands, front to back and back again, as though reading both sides of the question. Then she said, "What is his code, Mr. Hale?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the 23-year-old who had looked at the worst numbers of his life and said, "What do we need to do?" I thought about 15 years of watching him make decisions that other men would have found a way around, simply because finding a way around them was not something he was willing to do. I said, "He pays what is owed. He does what he believes is right, regardless of what it costs him. He does not explain himself to people who have not earned the explanation, and he does not require applause for things he considers simply correct. He is loyal to an unusual degree to the people and things he considers his responsibility. And he does not," I paused. "He does not often extend that circle, but when he does, it holds." She thought about that for some time. Then she said, "I'll accept the arrangement." I was not privy to the first weeks of it in any direct way. The Duke's steward, a capable older man named Fenwick, not the same Fenwick as Loam, a coincidence of Christian names that I had occasion to find confusing on more than one document, conducted the survey, and Mrs. Ashford's involvement was, so far as I understood, entirely professional and largely by correspondence and the occasional meeting at the estate offices in Carvenwick. I heard reports. She was thorough. She knew the eastern reaches of the county better than any of the Duke's own people, which was not surprising given that she had been managing them in one form or another since her husband's health began to fail. She had opinions, and she expressed them, and they were, almost invariably, correct. The tenancy disputes she had anticipated proved to be precisely the disputes that materialized. The drainage problems she had flagged turned out to be worse than the existing surveys had suggested. She had the eye of someone who has spent years learning to read a landscape for trouble before the trouble announces itself, which is not a talent that can be taught quickly or easily, and which the Duke's steward, who was a competent man but had not had her particular education, did not have. The Duke began attending the meetings in Carvenwick. This was, Fenwick the steward told me with the careful diplomacy of a man who likes his employer and has been surprised by him, not the usual practice. The Duke sent instructions. He did not attend county survey meetings. He was a man who had organized his time with the severe efficiency of someone who has more to manage than the hours will comfortably hold, and he had learned to delegate ruthlessly and review summaries rather than attending in person. He attended this meeting, and then the next, and then the one after that. I saw them for the first time truly together, in the same room with the rest of the world present but not central, at a dinner given by Lady Marchbanks in late October. Lady Marchbanks was one of those indomitable county hostesses who considers herself the curator of every significant social event in the region, and who had been, I gathered, watching the situation at Ashford Grange since September with the intense interest of a woman who recognizes a narrative when she sees one beginning. She had the great gift of observation that some women of her generation possessed, a radar for what was actually happening underneath what was being said. And she had apparently been watching the Tuesday meetings in Carvenwick with a degree of attention that she had not shared with anyone, but which was clearly producing conclusions. She seated them across from each other. I was 2 seats down from Mrs. Ashford, and had a clear angle on both of them. The Duke arrived late. He was always late to social events, not from rudeness but from the simple fact that he managed a great deal and did not place dinners at the top of the hierarchy. And he came in with that quality he had of taking up room without any obvious effort, the quality of a man who has been the most significant person in whatever space he entered for so long that it no longer requires any effort. He found his seat. He looked across the table. She was talking to Lord Ashby on her left, old Lord Ashby, who was restricted to the subjects of drainage and the legal complications of his late grandmother's will, and who took these subjects very seriously indeed, and she was doing it well. She was good in company, Mrs. Ashford, with the easy, interested manner of someone who finds people genuinely curious and gives them her full attention regardless of whether they are interesting or merely present. She had a way of attending to whoever she was talking to that made that person feel, correctly, I think, because I believe her interest was real, that they were the most interesting thing in the room. Old Lord Ashby, who had been telling his grandmother's story at county dinners for 40 years, looked visibly pleased with himself. The Duke watched her for a moment before she noticed him. Then she looked up, and their eyes met across the width of Lady Marchbanks's dining table, and something happened that I have thought about many times since and cannot fully describe. It was not dramatic. It was very quiet. It was the particular quality of a recognition, 2 people who have been, in their respective minds, circling each other and have just acknowledged simultaneously, in the way that simultaneous acknowledgments happen, that this is what they have been doing. She nodded once very slightly. He did the same. I looked away, with the sensation of having seen something private that had nonetheless been played out in front of 12 people, and registered by at least 3 of them, Lady Marchbanks chief among the 3. The conversation at dinner was general but not uninstructive. The Duke talked about the survey with the dry precision he brought to professional matters, and then with a dry humor that surprised people who hadn't heard it before. He had the kind of wit that comes out sideways, so that you aren't always sure you've heard it until you find yourself smiling after the moment has passed, which was disconcerting for people who expected severity and found the wit hidden inside it. Mrs. Ashford talked about the management of small estates in bad seasons, which she knew intimately and from the inside in a way that is rare, and the Duke listened with the specific quality of attention he brought to things he found genuinely worth hearing, complete, serious, unperformed. He asked her 2 or 3 questions. She answered them without condescension or false modesty. He asked follow-ups that demonstrated he had fully absorbed her answers, because the follow-ups were precisely the right questions to ask from the position she had just described. She answered those too, and I watched her, midway through the second follow-up, register the quality of the question, register it, and revise something in her assessment of him, very slightly, the way a careful person revises an assessment when they receive better information. At the end of dinner, Lady Marchbanks drew me aside while the others were gathering in the drawing room. She looked at me with the bright, satisfied expression of a woman who is right about something and knows it, and has been waiting for the right moment to say so. "Well," she said. "Lady Marchbanks," I said. "He hasn't taken his eyes off her since he sat down." "He is interested in the survey," I said. She has excellent command of the county's eastern. Edmund Hale, said Lady Marchbanks, I have been watching men at dinner tables for 60 years. Don't tell me about the survey. I returned to the drawing room. The Duke was standing near the fireplace with a glass he wasn't drinking from, and Mrs. Ashford was sitting on the settee closest to him, and they were talking. Not talking in the general way of people at a social gathering, not the pleasant, frictionless kind of conversation that takes place because it is expected and leaves no particular residue when it is finished. Talking the way people talk when they have found something unexpectedly worth pursuing and are being careful about it, moving through the opening rooms of each other's thinking and finding, in each room, something they hadn't anticipated finding. I found a chair and sat down, and tried to look as though I was examining the fireplace screen. What I heard in fragments went something like this. She said, "You are not what I expected." He said, "What did you expect?" A pause, then, someone easier to dismiss. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "I could say the same." "You expected to be able to dismiss me." "I expected," he said carefully, "to be able to file the whole business away as a thing I had done and move on to the next thing." She turned her glass in her hands. She said, "And instead," he said, with the dry precision of a man whose understatements cost him something, "I find myself interested in the survey." She heard it. A smile crossed her face, quick, real, nothing performed about it, the kind of smile that is involuntary because it is genuine and arises before the control that manages such things can catch it. And it did something to his expression that I had never seen before in 8 years of knowing him. He didn't smile back. He looked at the smile as though he was noting it for a purpose he hadn't yet determined, placing it somewhere precise and internal. "Mr. Hale told me you are honest," she said, in the manner of a man for whom dishonesty would feel like a waste of effort. "That's a fair characterization. He also said you have a code." "Did he?" "He meant it as a compliment, I think." "He's a reliable judge of things," the Duke said. "What do you make of it yourself?" She thought about it, actually thought about it, not the performance of consideration, but the real thing, the space of someone who takes questions seriously and doesn't answer before she is ready. Then she said, "I think a man with a code is more reliable than a man with good intentions. Good intentions change with the weather. A code holds." He was quiet for a moment, then very low with an evenness that contained something larger. "Yes. That's it exactly." I looked away. My study of the fireplace screen had become extremely concentrated. After that evening, I became aware of a rhythm that had established itself, the sort of thing you don't notice until it has been going on long enough to have acquired its own weight. The Duke of Thornwall found reasons to be in Carvenwick 2 or 3 times a week rather than once. The survey expanded in scope in ways that required more and lengthier consultations. Mrs. Ashford was consulted. The consultations ran long, longer than the survey's actual requirements could have justified. Fenwick the steward mentioned to me, with perfect professional diplomacy, that His Grace had taken an unusual interest in the eastern tenancies, and did I know of any particular issue there that might account for it. I said I did not know of any particular issue. I knew exactly what the issue was. I simply did not say so because it was not my saying to do. I also knew, because I had been watching both of them with the attention of a man who has known one of them for 8 years, and finds the other one increasingly remarkable, that nothing explicit had been said. They were circling each other in the manner of 2 people who have both had reasons to be careful. He because of a self-sufficiency that had hardened into habit over 15 years of managing everything alone, a self-sufficiency that had served him well, and that he perhaps did not yet understand the cost of. She because she had married once for what seemed like the right reasons, and the marriage had taught her, over 12 years, what it feels like to be loved for something you are not quite, and to spend your life quietly failing to become it. 2 people who had each, separately, concluded that relying on one's own competence was safer than relying on another person, and who had each found, in the other's company, something they had not been looking for and were not entirely sure what to do with now that they had found it. It was mid-November when it came to a head for the first time. I was at Ashford Grange going over some remaining documents. There were always remaining documents when an estate had been through what this one had been through, a paper trail of postponed and renegotiated and finally settled obligations that required careful unwinding. when the Duke arrived. He had been expected. Mrs. Ashford was making use of his steward's expertise in some repair work on the east wall, which had been deteriorating for 2 years at least, and the Duke had said he would come by to see how it was progressing. He arrived at 3 in the afternoon with Fenwick and 2 workmen, conducted a thorough inspection of the east wall with the focused attention he brought to structural questions, dismissed Fenwick and the workmen with precise instructions about the mortar and the pointed coursework that needed replacing, and came to find us in the small sitting room where I had papers laid out on the table. He sat down without being asked. This was a habit of his that I had observed before, the habit of a man who is sufficiently comfortable with his own authority that the question of permission never arises for him, and looked at the papers with a practiced eye. "What's left?" he asked. "3 things," I said, and named them. He nodded. He looked at Mrs. Ashford. She was annotating something in a small notebook she kept for estate business. She was always annotating things, noting what needed doing, what had been done, the state of the roof, the condition of the south paddock's drainage, the outstanding supplier accounts, the status of the tenant repairs she had been managing, and she looked up and found him watching her. There was a silence of several seconds that had a different quality from ordinary silence. Then she said, to the air between them rather than to either of us specifically, "The north kitchen needs a new range." "I know," he said. "I've asked Fenwick to source one." She set down her pen. She said with great deliberateness, "You don't need to do that." "I know. The estate is mine. The decisions about the estate are mine." She looked at him steadily. "I appreciate what you did in September, Your Grace, but I am not in need of management." He said, "I know that too." "Then why?" "Because I wanted to," he said, very simply, without any particular drama, just the flat, honest weight of it placed on the air between them. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze with the particular steadiness of a man who is accustomed to meaning what he says and waiting for others to arrive at the same understanding he has already reached. Then she said, "What does that mean, Thornwall?" He was quiet. I watched him consider. He said, "I'm not entirely sure yet." Which was, I reflected, looking at the papers that I was not reading, a more honest answer than most men would have given. He could have said something gracious and deflecting, something that maintained the professional fiction they had both been maintaining. He didn't. He said the true thing, even though the true thing was incomplete. She picked up her pen again. She said, "Tell me when you are." He said, "I will." And that was all. But something had shifted between them after that. Something loosened, very slightly, in the formal, careful way they handled each other. They didn't become demonstrative. Neither of them were people of demonstrative temperament, which was perhaps one of the things they recognized in each other and found both comfortable and interesting. But there was a quality of ease that hadn't been there before. He stopped pretending the survey was the reason he came to Carvenwick. She stopped pretending she didn't notice when he came. I had dinner with the Duke in late November at Thornwall Hall, alone, an unusual thing, as he was not a man who made a habit of social dinners for their own sake. He had invited me, and I was curious enough not to require a stated reason. The hall was not what people imagined when they imagined a duke's seat. It was large, certainly, and the proportions of the rooms were the proportions of real wealth, but it was not ornate. It had the quality of a working house, of a place that has been managed seriously by someone who finds ornament a distraction from function. There were books everywhere, and maps, and the kind of agricultural journals that require actual reading rather than merely decorative placement on a shelf. There was very little in the house that was there purely to be looked at. Everything was there because it was used. I noticed, on the desk in the library where he received me, a copy of a drainage survey pamphlet on eastern Dornshire. I recognized it because Mrs. Ashford had mentioned the same pamphlet to me in passing, some weeks before, as something she had found useful in managing Ashford Grange's lower fields. She had lent her copy to Fenwick the steward and not yet had it back. I did not mention what I had noticed. Over dinner he was, as he usually was with me, direct. We talked about the survey and about a piece of local legislation affecting the eastern tenancies and about a case I was currently managing that had some bearing on estate law. He ate with the focused efficiency of a man who considers meals primarily as necessary rather than as pleasures. He drank 1 glass of claret. Then, without preamble, he said, "What do you know about her husband?" I set down my fork. I know the debts, I said. I know the legal record. I didn't represent him personally. I didn't ask about the debts. I thought about that carefully. I said, I know that she managed the estate through the last 3 years of his life largely alone. I know that the conditions she managed it under were not comfortable and that the margin available to her was very small. I know that she has made no complaints to me, not one, and has spoken of him only in the factual register of someone who is being extremely careful about what they say. He was looking at his glass. He said, did he know what he had? It was an extraordinary question. I sat with it for a moment the way the question deserved. Then I said, no, I don't believe he did. He nodded once. He said nothing else on the subject. We talked about the legislation for another hour, and then I went home, and I thought about that question the whole way back through the November dark. Did he know what he had? In December, something happened that I was not present for, but which Mrs. Ashford told me about afterward with the careful precision she brought to everything, including things she was still in the process of understanding. The Duke had come to Ashford Grange on a Tuesday. Tuesdays had become, by December, a sort of fixed point, though no one had said so explicitly, and the Tuesday in question was still nominally a survey visit. They had gone over some survey materials together, and then walked the south paddock because there was a question about the drainage there that needed actual eyes on the ground rather than a map. It was cold, gray December cold, the kind that settles into stone walls and makes the distances look close, compressing the landscape into something intimate and particular. She had her coat and he had his, and they had walked the length of the paddock without needing to fill the silence, which she mentioned to me as something she had noticed specifically, because it was rare. She had been with people who could not tolerate silence, who needed it filled continuously, who used words as a kind of noise against the discomfort of being alone with themselves or another person. He wore silence like a coat. He was comfortable inside it. At the far end of the paddock, where the old stone wall ran along the property line with a neighbor's land, they had stopped and looked back at the house. Ashford Grange in December from the far end of the south paddock is a particular sight. The gray stone against the gray sky, the bare trees above the east wall, the garden put to bed, the house looking exactly like what it was. Something old and worth keeping, tended by someone who cared enough to do the work without an audience. She had said something that she hadn't planned to say. One of those things that comes out when your guard is down, and the person next to you has made you feel, without any particular effort on either side, that there is no particular cost to honesty. She had said, I am glad you came in September. He had looked at the house for a moment, then at her. He had said, so am I. And then, after a pause during which she had looked at the bare branches of the hedgerow and listened to the particular quiet of the December countryside, I should tell you something. Tell me. I didn't come because of any general principle of fairness about how creditors should conduct themselves, he said. I knew who you were. Not well, I had seen you at the county assizes 2 years ago when Halkett had that boundary dispute with the Merton family, and you spoke to the magistrate on behalf of one of your tenant families who had been denied access to a right-of-way they had held for 30 years. You didn't have to be there. It was not your dispute, and the tenants were not yours in any legal sense. You went anyway, and you made the case, and you were right about the law and right about the merits. I remembered it. She had been quiet for a long time, standing by the stone wall in the December cold, thinking about a thing she had done 2 years ago that she had largely forgotten. Then she had said, you came in September because of a right-of-way dispute. I came in September, he said, because I knew what kind of person was in that room. She had been unable to say anything for a moment, which was, I gathered, unusual for her. She had a facility with words, a control of response. That was one of the things I admired most about her. But she had stood by that stone wall in the gray December light and found herself, for the first time in some time, entirely without a next sentence. Finally, she had said, that is the most unusual thing anyone has ever told me. He said, is it good or bad? I don't know yet, she said. I'll tell you when I do. She told me this story sitting in my office on a Thursday morning with a mug of tea she held in both hands. And when she finished, she looked at the window for a moment, and then back at me with the expression of a woman who has just had a floor appear beneath her feet in a place where she thought there was none, and is not yet certain the floor will hold. She said, what do I do with that, Edmund? I said, I think you probably already know. I'm not sure I trust my own judgment in these matters. My judgment in these matters has a history." She paused. "I was married for 12 years to a man who seemed at first to see me very clearly. He had an idea of me, and the idea was flattering, and I spent the first 2 years trying to be the idea and the next 10 years slowly understanding that the idea was not me and that he had stopped looking at the actual person once he had what he wanted. I am not a foolish woman, Edmund. I know the difference between what I felt at 22 and what I am now. But I am also not." She stopped. "I have learned to be careful about this particular feeling." "He is not Reginald Ashford," I said. "No," she said quietly, "he is not." She looked at the window for a long time. She said, "Reginald paid attention to the things he found decorative, the things I was useful for he simply assumed. The things I actually was, the parts of me that were not particularly convenient or decorative, the opinions and the stubbornness and the way I have of going into a problem until I find the bottom of it. He found those things inconvenient and eventually did not bother with them. I was managed for 12 years, and I didn't fully understand it until he was gone, and I stopped feeling the shape of the management and found I could breathe differently." She set down her tea. "Thornwall looks at the opinions and the stubbornness. He asks about the bottom of the problem. He reads drainage pamphlets." "Yes," I said, "he does." "That terrifies me," she said. "More than being overlooked. Being overlooked I know how to manage. This is something else." "I know," I said. "What do I do with it?" "I think," I said carefully, "that you let it happen. And you trust what you know about what kind of person he is, which is considerable because you have been watching him carefully for 4 months, and I would back your judgment about people over almost anyone's I have met." She looked at me, she said, "And if I'm wrong?" "Then you will have been wrong about the one person who was worth the risk of being wrong about," I said, "which is not the worst thing." She thought about that for some time. Then she said, "All right. I want to tell you about Christmas at Thornwall Hall, because it is one of my clearest memories of that winter, and because it matters to the shape of what happened afterward." Lady Marchbanks had organized what she called a neighborhood gathering, her phrase for events that were in practice considerably more significant than the phrase suggested, at Thornwall Hall, which the Duke hosted with the cooperative air of a man who has long since decided that certain social machinery is less costly to allow than to resist. It was the 23rd of December. The hall was dressed for the season with greenery and candles, and the old silver that I suspected didn't come out often. And there were perhaps 30 people in the main rooms, including several families from the eastern side of the county, whom I recognized from their connection to the survey. Mrs. Ashford came alone, as she always came to social events, with a quiet self-possession that had by this point stopped surprising me but still commanded my genuine admiration. She wore dark green. She favored colors that didn't require attention, that did their work without advertising themselves. And she came in and was absorbed almost immediately into a conversation with old Mrs. Carver, who was a pleasant woman of 70 who raised spaniels and knew an extraordinary amount about turnip cultivation, and who had, I had come to understand, been a quiet supporter of Mrs. Ashford through the difficult years of the estate. I watched the Duke from across the room. He was hosting with the competent, slightly preoccupied air he brought to social obligations, talking to a local magistrate about the state of the roads, which was a genuine concern in the eastern part of the county and not merely a conversational placeholder, and I watched him notice when she came in. It was not theatrical. He didn't stop talking or turn his head sharply. But his attention moved in her direction and stayed there, in the way that attention does when it has found something it keeps returning to regardless of what else is demanding it. And I thought, this is beyond the survey now, in his own accounting as well as everyone else's, and I wonder if he knows it yet. He made his way to her eventually, perhaps 40 minutes after she arrived, which was probably as fast as hosting obligations permitted without being obvious, though it was probably obvious anyway to anyone paying the kind of attention Lady Marchbanks paid. And they talked for a long time by the window with the dark December gardens behind them and the candlelight of the hall in front of them. I could not hear most of what they were saying. I was across the room, talking to Lord Ashby about the grandmother's right-of-way case, which had developed new complications, and I did not feel that removing myself from Lord Ashby to eavesdrop would be either possible or appropriate. But I watched the quality of them together, the particular angle of his attention toward her, the way she used her hands when she was explaining something she found interesting, The moment when he said something that made her look at him with a quick reassessment, a recalibration of some internal measurement she had been carrying. And I thought that Lady Marchbanks, who had seated them across from each other at the October dinner with the deliberateness of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing, had probably been right to do it. Lady Marchbanks came to stand beside me at the end of the evening, when people were beginning to gather their coats, and the candles were burning low in the silver sticks. "He looks," she said, "like a man who has finally put down something heavy." I watched him still near the window, though the other guests had mostly moved to the hall, listening to something Mrs. Ashford was saying with the complete, serious attention that was, I had concluded, one of the most defining things about him. "She has that effect," I said. "She looks," Lady Marchbanks said, "like a woman who is not entirely sure whether to believe in something good." That was accurate. I could see it in the set of her shoulders, something held slightly in reserve, the caution of someone who has learned to check the heat before stepping toward a fire. "She'll get there," I said. "Oh, I know she will," said Lady Marchbanks. "I'm worried about whether he'll have the sense to say something before she talks herself back out of it." I had precisely the same concern. The conversation by the window that evening I know partially from what Mrs. Ashford told me later, processed in her careful way over several installments. The Duke had asked about the restoration work at Ashford Grange, genuinely asked, with the specificity of someone who had been thinking about it independently, wanting to know which rooms she was addressing first and what the condition of the upper floors was, and whether the north kitchen range had been sorted to her satisfaction. She had answered him, and then she had said, somewhat to her own surprise, "You think about Ashford Grange." He had said, "I think about what's happening at Ashford Grange, yes." "Why?" He had looked at her, then, "Because someone I find interesting is there." She had looked at the window and the dark gardens. She had said, "That is very direct." "You value directness, I have noticed." "I do, I've had enough of the indirect kind." "Then I will be direct," he said. "I am interested in the drainage and the north kitchen range and the condition of the east wall, and also I am interested in you. And I find that I am not entirely able to separate the two, which is probably information about something." She had told me this with the expression of someone who has heard something true and is still living with it. She had said, "He said it in the same tone of voice that he discusses the tenancies." "Yes," I said, "that's how he is." "It should not be romantic," she said, "and yet." "And yet," I agreed. January came with cold weather, and a development I had feared and done nothing to prevent. Sir Fenwick Loam had not forgiven the Duke for September, and his opinion of the whole business had been forming over the months since, along the lines of certain men who interpret a woman's rescue as an occasion for judgment about the woman rather than admiration for the man who acted. He had been making remarks around the county, in the club at Carvenwick, at a sporting dinner at Lord Ashby's, apparently in front of 2 tenant farmers at the grain market who had then repeated it to other people, as tenants do. The remarks were of the predictable kind. The implication that Mrs. Ashford's arrangement with the Duke was of a nature that required no legal documentation, that the survey was a convenient fiction invented to give the arrangement a respectable surface. He implied this with the particular boldness of a man who has found that other people's silence about the remarks encourages him to make more of them. I heard about this from 2 sources before Mrs. Ashford heard about it herself. When she heard, from old Mrs. Carver, who had the best intentions and the worst timing, telling her over tea in an attempt to arm her against a rumor Mrs. Carver thought she should know about, Mrs. Ashford absorbed it in the manner she absorbed most things, without visible reaction, with a composure that was real and that cost something. She came to see me the morning after she heard. She was sitting in the chair across from my desk with her hands folded in her lap. That posture I recognized, the deliberate stillness she used when something was being controlled rather than merely contained, and she said, "I have been thinking." "All right." "I have been thinking that the arrangement with the survey was always going to be seen in a certain way by certain people, and that I was naive to believe otherwise. The sensible thing is to end it." She said it briskly, as though she had practiced the sentence. "Write to Fenwick and say that I've given the survey what I can and think it's reached a natural conclusion, and I wish everyone well. It removes the source of the talk." "Willa," I said, and she registered the Christian name with a slight widening of her eyes, because I had not used it before. Ending the arrangement does not remove the source of the talk. It removes you from an arrangement that Loam will then describe in whatever terms suit him best, and they will not be generous terms. She looked at me. The only thing that actually addresses what Loam is saying, I said, is not your withdrawal, it is the Duke's answer to it. I can't ask him to. I know you can't, you won't have to, I paused. Give me 1 day. She was quiet for a long time, then she said, 1 day. I went to Thornwall Hall that afternoon. The Duke received me in the library. He was at his desk. He looked up when I came in and read my expression in the way he always read things, quickly, accurately, without comment, and set down his pen. What's happened, he said. I told him about Loam. He listened with absolute stillness. The particular stillness I had learned over 8 years meant the thing was going into a cold, deep place inside him where it would be dealt with in his own time and his own way. Then I told him what Mrs. Ashford intended to do. He was quiet for 10 seconds. Then, she's going to leave. She intends to write today. I asked her to wait until tomorrow. He looked at the desk. He said quietly, "Why is she?" Because nothing has been said, I told him. She is a woman who has learned that feelings are not facts until they are stated. And nothing has been stated. He looked at me. The expression on his face was one I had not seen before, not distress, not the soft version of distress that men perform. The face of a man who has been managing something very carefully and has just been told by someone he trusts that the management has been missing the actual point. He said, I was trying not to put pressure on her. I know that. She has just come through a difficult period. The estate, the auction, the years before that. I didn't want to add another thing she had to navigate. Caspian, I said, and the use of his Christian name the first time in 8 years registered. She is not fragile. She is one of the least fragile people I have ever met. What she is a woman who needs to know what she is standing on. She will not ask for it. She considers asking for it a kind of weakness, which is perhaps worth discussing with her in due course, but now is not the moment. She needs to know. He was very still. She will leave, I said, and do it composedly and spend the next year convincing herself she made the right decision, because she is very good at convincing herself of things that are true, and this one will be true enough to be convincing. And you will have lost. I thought about how to say it. You will have lost the only person who has made you sit differently in a room in the 8 years I have known you. He looked at me for a long time. Then he stood up and reached for his coat. Is she in Carvenwick tomorrow? He asked. She has household accounts at Tabor's. Tuesday morning. He put on his coat. He looked at the window, at the dark January outside the library glass, and then at me. Go home, Edmund, he said. I'll handle it. What happened the following morning I know from 2 sources. Mrs. Ashford, who told me most of it in pieces over the following weeks, and from my own direct observation of the conclusion, because my office window faces the main street of Carvenwick, and I happened to be standing at it when the final part occurred. Mrs. Ashford had gone to the market square at 9 in the morning to settle the quarterly account with Mr. Tabor. The market in Carvenwick on Tuesday mornings draws most of the town and considerable portions of the surrounding countryside, and on this Tuesday it contained, among others, Sir Fenwick Loam and Mr. Halkett, who had come in to discuss some matter at the solicitor's office and had stopped at the market en route. Mrs. Ashford saw them before they saw her. She continued to Tabor's with her chin at precisely the angle it had been before, because she was not a woman who altered her trajectory based on who was watching. She was at Tabor's counter, going through the quarterly account when Loam and Halkett came in for something. Loam's housekeeper had an order there and found her. What Loam said I will not repeat in detail. It was the same character of remark he had been making around the county, now delivered to her face with the particular boldness of a man who has been saying a thing privately long enough that he has lost his sense of the line. He implied that her arrangement with the Duke was of a nature that should not surprise anyone, given the circumstances of a widow in financial difficulty. Tabor went very still behind his counter and looked at a spot on the wall. Mrs. Ashford set down the account book. She turned and looked at Loam with the composed face she put on over a very considerable anger and said, You will stop speaking now, Sir Fenwick. Loam did not stop. He said something further. Halkett, who had some residual decency, went somewhat pale and found the door suddenly interesting. And then the door of Tabor's opened, and the Duke of Thornwall walked in. He was in his good coat, the dark one, county business, not riding clothes, and he was alone. No steward, no manservant. Just the Duke in his good coat on a Tuesday morning in a grocer's shop where, so far as anyone present could recall, he had never set foot before in his life. He came in and took in the scene in 3 seconds. Loam, Halkett, Tabor behind the counter, Mrs. Ashford with the account book and the composed face over the anger, and understood it completely. He looked at Loam for 1 moment. Then he stepped past him, not dramatically, not as a performance. Simply in the way that one steps past something that is not the important thing in the room, because it is not, and he had somewhere more important to be. He went to Mrs. Ashford. He stood in front of her between her and Loam, simply because that was where he stood, and he said, in a voice that was entirely level and entirely audible to everyone present, "Willa, I need to speak with you." Not Mrs. Ashford, Willa. She looked at him, he looked at her, not at Loam, not at the shop, at her. He said, "I have been conducting myself under the misapprehension that patience was the same thing as consideration. I am told by someone I trust that it is not." He paused. "I am told you are planning to write a letter this afternoon." "I was," she said carefully. "I am asking you not to." She said, "Thornwall." "Caspian," he said. "At this point I think you should call me Caspian." She was very still. He turned then and looked at Loam and said, in exactly the same level tone without any particular drama, "You will treat this woman with the respect she is owed, or you will hear from my solicitor before the week is out. I have no interest in your opinions. I have a considerable interest in her, which I have not stated as plainly as I should have and which I am in the process of correcting. Good morning." Loam left. Halkett had already gone. From my window, I watched them come out of Tabor's together and walk south along the main street in the January light, not touching, because they were not yet people who touched in the main street of Carvenwick, but walking with the quality of 2 people who have arrived at the same place by different paths, and found, with a relief that neither of them is going to express dramatically, that the other one has got there too. He said the rest of it that afternoon at Ashford Grange, in the small sitting room where I had so often gone over papers at the corner desk. She told me about it in pieces over the following weeks, processed in her careful way, examined from several angles before being given to me. He had asked if he might court her. He had used the word with the seriousness that made it mean something rather than merely gesture at meaning, a statement of purpose. "I intend to be here in a way you can rely on, and I want you to know that is what this is." She had said, "You've been doing it since October." He had said, "I know, I'm asking permission to do it properly." She had been quiet for a long time, then she had said, "Caspian." He had said, "Yes. You should know that I am not easy." "I'm not easy either. I have opinions about everything, including things that are not, strictly speaking, my business. I know they're almost always right. I will not be managed." "I know that too. Then I don't want to manage you, I want," he had stopped, then more carefully, "I want to know what you think. About everything. I have wanted that since September, and I'm only now saying it clearly, which is a failure of nerve I am correcting." He paused. "I want to be in the same room as you indefinitely. That is the clearest I can be." She had looked at him for a long time, she told me. At the man who had come to Tabor's grocery in his good coat, and the man who had shown up to a boundary dispute in the county assize's records, because he had read about a woman who showed up for people she didn't have to show up for. Then she had said, "Ask me again in the spring." He had said, "I will." February was, in the event, the month in which they arrived at the thing they were arriving at, without speaking of it directly. They did not need to speak of it directly. They had both, by this point, said enough. What they needed was to simply be in each other's company without the management, without the careful positioning and the professional fiction, and to discover whether what was there between them was real or only the product of unusual circumstances. It was real. I saw them at a county meeting in early February about the road legislation, which affected the eastern tenancies and which Mrs. Ashford had developed strong opinions about. She had prepared a position paper, an actual written document, careful and thorough, with specific references to the relevant statutes and their practical implications, and she presented it at the meeting with the composed authority of a woman who has done the work and knows it. The Duke listened. He asked 3 questions. She answered them without concession or softening. He agreed with her on 2 and pushed back on 1, and she pushed back on the pushback, and he considered her counter and revised his position, not in the performance of conceding, but in the actual adjustment of someone who has received better information and acted on it. After the meeting, I walked out with them both. By accident, genuinely by accident, I had been heading to my office, and we came out of the meeting room at the same time. And they walked together along the main street of Carvenwick talking about the road legislation as though they had been talking about things together for years, which in some sense they had, and I felt quite acutely that I was walking alongside something that had outgrown the category of any professional arrangement and was simply what it was. 2 people who had found something to share and were sharing it. I excused myself at the corner of the market square and went back to my office. I thought they probably didn't notice for at least 2 blocks. March arrived, and with it the first warmth of the year, and the roses at Ashford Grange put out their first determined shoots against the old stone wall, and the South Paddock drainage question was resolved to everyone's satisfaction, and the Tuesdays had expanded to include occasional Thursdays and one Saturday that had begun as an estate matter and ended. I gathered from the quality of Mrs. Ashford the following Monday morning as something rather more than an estate matter. She did not say this directly. She said that the work on the east wall had come along nicely and that the north kitchen range was performing well. She said these things with the particular expression of a woman who is talking about the north kitchen range while thinking about something else entirely. I did not ask. He asked her on the last day of March. He did not tell me beforehand. He simply did it in the garden at Ashford Grange beside the dark red roses that had reached their first real flowering of the season. She said yes. She came to my office on the 1st of April and told me. She sat across from my desk, and I looked at her and saw what I had been waiting to see, not the braced, careful composure of September, not the watchful stillness of December. The other kind. The kind that comes when you have arrived somewhere you can actually rest. I said, "I'm very glad." She said, "So am I." She looked at the window for a moment, the familiar spring light of Carvenwick's Main Street. She said, "He asked me afterward why I said yes. He said he wanted to understand exactly what it was, so that he could be certain he was keeping it." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that he is a man who showed up to a right-of-way dispute he had nothing to do with because he thought the person who showed up for others should have someone show up for her." She paused. "And that he came to Tabor's grocery in his good coat on a Tuesday morning because he had left something important unsaid for too long, and that the instinct to correct that, to do the right thing when it costs you something, without waiting for a better moment, is the quality I trust most in a person." "And what did he say to that?" She smiled, the quick, real smile, the involuntary kind, the one she had given him across Lady Marchbanks's dining room in October. "He said it was an extremely precise answer." "It is," I said. "He said he was glad I was precise." "He would be, he is too." She stood up to go, and then she stopped at the door and turned and said, "Edmund, for what it's worth, whatever you said to him in January." "I told him the truth," I said. "Yes," she said, "I know, thank you." They were married in June, at the small church in Carvenwick, in the presence of the county and Lady Marchbanks, who wept with a freedom entirely inconsistent with her habitual manner, and which I found privately very moving. The Duke arrived on time, which his household staff told me afterward was unprecedented for any social occasion in their collective memory. He stood at the front of the church with the particular stillness of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and has made his peace with the full size of it. She came in on the arm of old Mr. Carver, the pleasant Mrs. Carver's husband, who had offered with the simple dignity of a man who understands what such a thing means, and she walked down the aisle in the pale blue she had chosen, which was not what people generally wore to weddings, but which was entirely her, and she was looking at the man at the front of the church with the expression I have thought about many times since and cannot improve upon. She was not performing anything. She was not maintaining anything. She was looking at him with the expression of someone who has checked the heat and found it genuine and is walking toward it. He watched her come. He stood very still. When she reached him and turned to face him, the expression on his face was something I could not have predicted from 8 years of knowing him. It was open. Entirely and unexpectedly open, the face of a man who has put down every piece of armor he owns, and is standing in the results of that without any particular desire to pick any of it back up. She told me later that it was the first moment she had seen him afraid. Not of the marriage and not of the future, but of the size of the feeling, the specific vertigo of a man who has kept himself contained for a very long time and has just allowed himself to be undone by something larger than containment. She had taken his hand before the ceremony began. Just that, her hand in his, unhurried, certain, as though it was exactly where it was supposed to be, and she saw no reason to be uncertain about that. He had looked down at their joined hands and then at her, and his face had settled into something steadier than the vertigo, and he had been, for the rest of the ceremony, completely himself. The gravity and the near smile and the absolute attention he brought to things that mattered. I will note, for the sake of the record, that Sir Fenwick Loam left the county some months before the wedding. What the Duke communicated to him privately I do not know. Loam departed Dornshire with the quiet of a man who has been made to understand something about the difference between what he is owed and what he has been taking, and has decided another county is preferable to further education. Halkett I see occasionally in Carvenwick. He is invariably polite. He has never mentioned September. I visited Thornwall Hall in September of that year, the first September of their marriage, on a routine estate matter. The Duke received me in the library as he always had. He was at his desk. But there was a second desk now, set at an angle to his, and it had papers on it in the close organized hand I knew, estate accounts, a notebook with careful margin annotations, the working papers of someone managing several things at once with a clear system. I looked at the second desk. The Duke looked at it briefly, with an expression that contained an entire sentence he did not speak aloud. She came in halfway through our meeting to ask about one of the Eastern tenancies. She was managing those herself now, which was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. And they talked about it with the brisk, comfortable shorthand of two people who have been thinking in parallel about the same problems long enough that they don't need context before discussing solutions. He had a point, she had a counter. He conceded it with a small nod she acknowledged with an equally small acknowledgement. Then she looked at me and said, "Edmund, you'll stay for dinner." I said I would. She went back to whatever she had been doing. He looked at the door where she had been for a moment after she had gone, with the expression of a man who has been surprised by something and is still, months later, working out the full size of the surprise. He said, eventually, "She has opinions about the Northwood drainage." "I imagine she does," I said. "She's right about it." "I would expect so." He looked at his papers. He said, in the tone of a man saying something he has not said aloud before, "I thought I understood what I was doing when I went to September." "You didn't." "I understood the legal part, the cost, what it would achieve, what was right." He paused. "I didn't understand that it would turn out to be the most consequential decision I ever made." "You were correcting an injustice," I said. "Yes," he said, "but that's not all I was doing." He picked up his pen, he looked at the papers. Then he said very quietly, not quite to me, "She asked me in March if I knew what I had. She was asking about the Northwood. I answered the practical question, but I thought about the other one for a long time." He began to write. I looked at my own papers. After a moment he said, without looking up, "I know what I have." I did not reply. I did not need to. We had dinner in the long room, just the three of us, because neither of them required company for its own sake. The room had changed from my earlier visits. It was inhabited now in the specific way that rooms become inhabited when someone has chosen to be in them and made small decisions that accumulate into a life. A lamp that had not been there before, books she had added to the shelves, and on the sideboard in a plain vase, dark red roses from Ashford Grange. He had said nothing about the roses. He didn't need to. They said what they said. After dinner they talked about the estates, about a crop question on one of the North properties, about a book he was reading that she had also read and disagreed with on 2 points she laid out with great precision. He engaged with each point seriously. I sat in the long room at Thornwall Hall and thought about September, about the drawing room at Ashford Grange and the 4 creditors arranged on her furniture and the door opening. Nobody knows at the beginning what they are beginning. You have to proceed into it without the map, guided only by the code you carry and the quality of the person who is walking in the same direction. He had a code, she had a code. Both codes, it turned out, pointed the same way. I have been a barrister for 31 years. I have drawn up many marriage settlements. I have not drawn up one that gave me as much quiet satisfaction as theirs. And I have never, in 31 years, watched a man in his good coat step past a man like Loam as though he were furniture, and go to the woman who mattered, and say the thing that needed saying. I think about it still. That is what a code looks like in the end when it meets the right person. Not a principle, not an abstraction. A man who came to a Tuesday market because someone needed to say something and he was the one who had to say it. That is all, that is the whole of it. I should say something more about those February weeks, because they did not happen in a vacuum, and because the texture of them matters to understanding how two people who had both decided, separately and for reasons that made sense, to rely primarily on themselves, arrived at a place where relying on each other felt not like a risk, but like a resolution. February in Dowager is not a mild month. It is gray and cold and occasionally wet, and the county has a habit of turning inward during it. People stay closer to home, social occasions thin out, and the rhythm of things contracts to the essential. It is, in this way, a useful month for understanding what the essential is. Mrs. Ashford and the Duke spent a good deal of February at Ashford Grange, working on matters that were partly the survey and partly the ongoing restoration of the estate and partly, I gathered, simply the accumulation of time together that had not yet been given a name but had acquired, by February, enough weight to stand on its own. I know some of what happened during those weeks from things she said to me afterward, not all at once, but in the way she said most things about this, in pieces, as she turned them over, like a person who takes a stone from a river and examines it in the light to see what it actually is before deciding where to place it. She told me about a Tuesday in early February when the heating in the small sitting room failed, a problem with the flue that Fenwick's workmen were due to address, but had not yet addressed, and they had moved to the kitchen, which had the new range and was warm and practical, and not in the least a formal space for the kind of professional consultation they were nominally engaged in. She had made tea. He had accepted it without any particular comment about the change of setting, because he was a man who adapted to circumstances without drama. They had gone over the survey materials and then talked about the road legislation position paper, and then about something she had been reading about the management of hill grazing land in Scotland, which was not relevant to Dowager but which she had found interesting and which he found, when she explained the relevant passages, equally interesting. At some point, the survey materials had been set aside, and the road legislation position paper had been folded and put away, and they were simply talking, sitting at the kitchen table with the new range doing its work in the background, and the February gray outside the window, talking the way two people talk when they have stopped performing any category for each other and are simply themselves. She had asked him about his brother, the brother who had died in the same fever as his father 15 years ago when he was 23 and had inherited everything. She asked it directly because she was a direct person, and she asked it because she had sensed that it mattered, and she wanted to understand the thing that had mattered. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said something that she told me with the careful attention she gave to things she wanted to keep accurately. My brother was 5 years older than me, and he knew from childhood that he would be Duke and I would not, and I think he carried that knowledge more easily than I would have. He liked people. He liked social occasions. He liked the things that came with the title. I liked the land and the accounts and the management. We had between us one complete Duke. He had paused. When they died, I thought for a long time that I had only the management half, that the part of it that required being present for people in the way that my brother was present for them was simply not available to me. She had asked him, was it? He had said, after a very long pause, I begin to think it may be, with the right conditions. She had told me this with the expression of someone who is still processing what was said. She said, he said it very quietly, as though it were something he had not quite admitted to himself before. What did you say? I asked. I said I had a similar question about myself, she said. Whether the part of me that could trust something good was still available, or whether 12 years of not being trusted with things had, whether I had managed that part of myself away along the way. She looked at the window. And he said that from everything he could observe, that part was entirely present and functioning well. Was he right? I asked. Yes, she said, but it mattered to hear it said by someone who had been paying attention. That was February. I should also tell you about a Thursday in mid-February, because Mrs. Ashford told me about it, and it was, she said, one of the things she kept coming back to when she was trying to understand what was happening. She had been working at her desk in the study at Ashford Grange, going over the tenant accounts for the quarter, when she became aware that the Duke had been standing in the doorway for several minutes without announcing himself. Not in any unsettling way, she was not a person who startled easily, but in the way that someone stands who has been watching something and has found it worth watching. She had looked up and found him there. She had said, "How long have you been standing there?" He had said, "Some minutes." "Why didn't you say something?" He had said, "You were working, I didn't want to interrupt." She had looked at him for a moment. She said, "You didn't want to interrupt my accounts." "The accounts appeared to be going well," he said. "I didn't want to disrupt whatever you were doing to them." She had found this, she told me, both entirely absurd and entirely genuine, and the combination of the two had done something to her that she was still, at the time she told me, in the process of naming. She said, "He was watching me add up columns of figures and he didn't want to interrupt because the columns were going well." "Yes," I said. "That is not a thing that Reginald would ever have done," she said. "Reginald did not notice when I was doing something. He noticed when I had stopped doing it." I thought about that. I said, "What did you say to the Duke?" She said, "I told him to come in and sit down," and he did. And he went back to reading something he had brought with him, and I went back to the accounts, and we sat in the same room for an hour not talking, and it was— She stopped. She tried again. "It was the most comfortable hour I had had in a very long time, which is not what I expected from that. It is a particular kind of intimacy to be comfortable in silence with someone. It is, I think, more intimate than conversation, because it requires trusting the other person with the space around you and not needing to fill it. Most people cannot do it. The Duke could. Mrs. Ashford could. They had both, separately, learned to be sufficient in silence, and having found someone else who was sufficient in it, they could be in it together without it being lonely, which was what silence usually was for people who were accustomed to filling it. She had said to me, "I kept waiting for him to become someone else. That's what happens in my experience. People are one thing and then they become another thing, and the second thing is more true, and the problem is that the second thing has been there from the beginning and you simply weren't looking at it correctly." She looked at the window. "He is the same in the kitchen with the tea and in the south paddock in December and at Lady Marchbanks's dining table. He is the same in the county meeting and sitting in my study while I add up columns. He is the same person in all of those places." "That is not very common," I said. "No," she said, "it is not. I should also tell you about the day in late February when the matter of the North Kitchen range came up again, because it resolved something that had been unresolved since November. The range had been installed. It was working well. Mrs. Ashford had been for some time thinking about the fact that the Duke had arranged for it without being asked, and about what she had said to him about management, and about his response, which had been, "I know," and about whether the thing she had called management was in fact management or something else wearing management's shape. She raised this with me in my office in Carvenwick on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting across the desk with a cup of tea, and the direct expression she wore when she was working through something she wanted to say correctly. "The range," she said. "I've been thinking about the range." I waited. I told him in November that I wasn't in need of management, and he said, "I know." And then I said, "Then why?" And he said, "Because I wanted to." She looked at her tea. "I have been thinking about the difference between management and wanting to. They look very similar from the outside, but they are not the same thing." "No," I said. "They are not. Reginald managed me in the sense that he arranged things for me and made decisions about things and did not particularly ask what I wanted because he had an idea of what was appropriate and acted on the idea. He was not unkind about it. He simply did not think to ask." She paused. "Thornwall, Caspian, sourced the range because he had been at Ashford Grange and had seen the North Kitchen and thought it needed a better range and had the means to address it and did so. He then told me about it. He did not wait for me to ask. And when I said I wasn't in need of management, he accepted that immediately and said, "I know," without arguing and without explaining. She looked at me. "That is not management." "No," I said. "I don't believe it is. Management is doing things for a person because you have decided what they need. What he did is," she tried to find the word, "it is noticing something and acting on the noticing because you can, and then telling the person about it and accepting whatever they say. That is a different thing." "Yes," I said. It is a very different thing. It is. She drank her tea. She said, I have been afraid of the wrong thing. In what sense? I have been afraid of being managed again, of having someone decide what I need and arrange my life around what they have decided. I have been watching for that very carefully, but that is not what this is. She set down the cup. What this is someone who pays attention, and that is harder to know what to do with. Because attention is the thing I actually wanted and didn't have, and it is more frightening to have a thing you actually wanted than to have a thing that is merely not terrible. I said, yes, that is very accurate. She looked at me. She said, I'm going to stop being afraid of it. I said, I think that's wise. She said, I'm going to say yes in the spring. I said, I think that's wise too. She finished her tea. She went back to Ashford Grange. And in March the roses put out their first leaves, and on the last day of that month the Duke asked her in the garden, and she said yes. The wedding in June was, as I have said, a quiet and dignified affair. Quiet only in the sense that the people present were there because they belonged there, and dignified only in the sense that everyone present understood what they were witnessing and treated it accordingly. Lady Marchbanks did not treat it quietly. She had been waiting for it since September, and she greeted the arrival of it with the warmth of someone whose very accurate predictions have finally come true. She sat in the second pew on the left and wept freely, which I found touching and which I suspect the Duke and Mrs. Ashford, the Duchess of Thornwall, as she was becoming, were both too occupied with each other to notice. The ceremony itself was straightforward and conducted with the efficiency that both of them preferred in formal proceedings. The vows were said clearly and without any particular performance, because they were people who did not perform things they meant. When it was done and they had turned to face the congregation, the Duke looked at the assembled room with an expression I did not recognize. Not the gravity, not the near smile, not any expression I had catalogued in 8 years. It was the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and is surprised by the size of the arriving, and is not, for once, going to manage the surprise away. She saw it, she took his hand, he looked at her. The expression settled, became simply happiness, which is the word I have been avoiding because it sounds insufficient but is in fact exactly right. I did not manage to avoid it indefinitely. That was the word, that was what I watched happen. The September visit to Thornwall Hall, which I have already described, stays with me most clearly of all the things I witnessed that year. The second desk, the roses in the plain vase, the way he looked at the door after she had gone through it, his voice when he said, not quite to me, I know what I have. 31 years of practice, many settlements, many legal arrangements of many kinds. None that gave me what that one gave me. I drove home that September evening in the late light, thinking about the man who had come to Tabor's grocery in his good coat, and the woman who had stood at the September window looking at the late roses against the stone wall of her garden, and all the distances between those two moments. All the Tuesdays. All the silences worn comfortably. The South paddock in December and the county court 2 years before that, and the way he had looked at her across Lady Marchbanks's dining table and nodded once. A code, just a code. What is owed done? The right thing even when the moment is Tabor's grocery on a Tuesday morning, and the right thing requires saying something in a grocer's shop in front of people you do not particularly want as witnesses. She had said, the instinct to correct that when it matters. He had said, I know what I have. Those two sentences together are the whole of it, I think. Everything else is detail. Though the detail, I must say, has been very good. I want to return, briefly, to something I mentioned in passing and did not give the weight it deserves. The question of Mrs. Ashford's own history with Reginald Ashford and what it had done to her capacity for this. I am not a man who thinks much about psychology as a formal matter. I am a barrister, and barristers deal in evidence and argument, not in the interior landscapes of people's feelings. But I have sat across from a great many people in 31 years, and I have observed, over time, what happens to a person who is ignored in the particular way that Reginald Ashford ignored his wife. It is not the dramatic kind of neglect that produces obvious wounds. It is something subtler and in some ways more damaging. The steady, sustained experience of being present in a room and not being seen in it. Of speaking and finding that your words are noted without being heard, registered without being absorbed. Of having preferences and finding that they are accommodated in the way that furniture is accommodated, moved around to suit the room rather than considered on their own terms. Of being useful and capable, and managing a great deal, and finding that the managing is taken for granted in the way that the function of the house is taken for granted, expected to work without requiring any particular acknowledgement. 12 years of that, for someone who had come into it with intelligence and capability, and I gathered, a genuine willingness to build something. 12 years produced a woman who was very good at self-sufficiency and very careful about what she allowed herself to need, because needing things and having them not be available is its own particular education. What the Duke of Thornwall did, largely without intending it as a gift, but simply because it was how he was built, was to pay attention. He paid attention in the practical sense, the drainage pamphlet, the north kitchen range, the way he asked the right follow-up at dinner because he had actually heard what she said rather than merely processed it as sound. He paid attention in the deeper sense, the way he watched her face when she was working through a problem, the way he remembered not just what she had said but what she had meant by it, the way he asked about the tenant families at the assizes and was interested in the answer. He paid attention in the sense of showing up, Tuesday after Tuesday, the lane behind the church, Tabor's grocery in his good coat. She had said in my office in February that she had been afraid of the wrong thing. She had been watching for management, and what was there was attention, and those two things look similar from the outside and are in fact entirely different, and the confusion between them had cost her several months of unnecessary caution, though I do not think she regrets the caution in retrospect. It was the right caution to have. She had good reasons for it. The fact that it turned out not to apply to this particular situation does not make the caution wrong. What I have come to think over the time since is that what happened between the Duke of Thornwall and Mrs. Willa Ashford is a simple thing made complicated only by the accumulated histories that two people bring to any meeting. A man with a code found a woman with a code, and the two codes pointed in the same direction, and they found this out slowly and carefully over 4 months of Tuesdays and survey materials and December paddocks and kitchen tables and silences worn comfortably together. And then the Duke came to Tabor's grocery on a Tuesday morning in his good coat and said the thing he should have said earlier, and she said yes to the spring, and in the spring she said yes again, and that was that. That is, in outline, the whole of it. The texture of it, as I have tried to give you, is considerably richer than the outline suggests. That is always the way with things that matter. The outline is quick, the texture is where the thing actually lives. The matter of the roses is perhaps the best illustration of this. She had brought them from Ashford Grange, cuttings from the old stock that had been against the stone wall when I first walked up the drive in September. The dark red ones that were the first thing I noticed about the house and the last thing I thought about as I drove away, and she had put them in a plain vase on the sideboard at Thornwall Hall. He had not mentioned the roses. He did not need to mention the roses. The roses were a statement that required no annotation. I am here. This is mine. I have made a choice about where to put my roots, and this is where I have put them. The Duke of Thornwall looked at the roses on the sideboard in September, and the expression on his face was not an expression I will attempt to describe, because some things are better left as they are rather than translated into sentences that will inevitably not quite reach them. I have been a barrister for 31 years. I have drawn up many settlements. I have watched many transactions. I have watched once two people who both had very good reasons to manage alone discover that they did not have to. That is the rarest thing I have ever seen in a drawing room. I am glad I was there to see it. There is one more thing I should tell you about, because it speaks to the character of both of them and because I was present for it, which does not always happen with the things that speak most clearly to a person's character. It was in October of the year after the wedding, the 2nd October. The survey, which had by then long since completed its official purpose and been wound up in the formal sense, had given way to a joint project that Mrs. Ashford had initiated, and that the Duke had immediately taken up with the focused enthusiasm he brought to things he found genuinely worth doing. The project was an attempt to address the long-standing right-of-way issues affecting several of the Eastern tenant families, not just the one she had spoken for at the assizes 3 years earlier, but a cluster of similar disputes that had been building for some time and that, she had concluded after careful study, all traced to a survey error made 2 generations ago that had been propagated forward through every subsequent document without anyone checking the original. She had found this, she told me, by going back to the original survey maps, which were kept in the county archives, and which no one had consulted in many years because they were inconvenient to access, and everyone assumed the later documents were accurate. She had gone to the archives on a Wednesday morning, alone, without asking anyone's permission or announcing what she was doing, and she had found the error and spent 3 hours confirming that it was an error and not a misunderstanding on her part. And then she had come to my office with the original survey folded under her arm, and a look of the concentrated satisfaction of someone who has been right about something, and now has the evidence. I looked at the original survey. She was right. The error was clear once you saw it, and once you saw it you understood immediately why every dispute in the Eastern Cluster had gone nowhere. They had all been arguing about the later documents, none of which were correct, and the error was foundational enough that the arguments had been, in effect, built on sand. I said, "This resolves all of them." She said, "Yes, that's what I thought." I said, "The Duke is going to want to see this." She said, "He already has. I showed him on Thursday." I said, "What did he say?" She said, with the particular expression she wore when she was reporting something that had pleased her. He said, "I wonder how long it's been wrong." And then he said, "You went to the original," not as a question. As though that was obviously what should have been done, and he was simply confirming that it was what had been done. "It obviously was what should have been done," I said. "Yes," she said, "but Reginald would have said, 'How remarkable,' and then changed the subject. Thornwall said, 'You went to the original,' and then spent 40 minutes going over the implications with me because he found them as interesting as I did." She was not making a comparison. She was making an observation about what it is like to have someone actually engage with the thing you have found, as though the finding is worth engaging with rather than merely noting. She was still, in the 2nd year of her marriage, noticing the things that were different. I suspect she noticed them for some time after that, too. Some differences take a while to stop surprising you, because the baseline takes a while to shift. The Duke filed the necessary legal corrections with my assistance over the following weeks, and the right-of-way disputes in the Eastern Cluster were resolved in February of that year, and the tenant families affected received formal acknowledgement of what they had been owed and had not been given for 2 generations. Several of them came to call at Thornwall Hall to thank the Duchess, who received them in the long room with the straightforward warmth of a woman who finds nothing awkward about being thanked for something she did, because it was right. The Duke was present for one of those visits, sitting in the corner with something he was reading, and he did not draw attention to himself, but he was there, bearing witness, being present in the way that he was present for things now, not managing, not directing, simply there in the same room, paying attention. One of the tenant women, a Mrs. Hadley, older, who had been waiting for her family's access to the disputed water right for 11 years, said to the Duchess, when the formal thanks were done and they were having tea, that she had heard the story of the archive visit and the original survey, and had thought it a very like thing for a person to do, to go back to the beginning when everyone else had given up. The Duchess said, "Someone should have done it years ago." Mrs. Hadley said, "Not everyone does the thing that should be done, Your Grace. That's the whole of it, isn't it? The ones who do are the ones worth knowing." I saw the Duchess glance at the Duke in the corner. He was looking at her too. He had been looking at her. She turned back to Mrs. Hadley. She said, "Yes, that's the whole of it." I have thought about that exchange many times, about the way she looked at him and the way he was already looking, about the ease of it by October of the 2nd year, the ease that is not relaxation but the deeper thing, the kind that comes from trusting entirely the person you are in the room with. She had worried in December of the 1st year that the part of her that could trust something good had been managed away. She had been wrong about that. It had been there all along. It had simply been waiting for the conditions. He had wondered at the kitchen table in February whether the part of him that could be present for people in the way his brother had been present for them was available to him. He had been wrong about that too, or not wrong exactly, but incomplete. It was not the same kind of presence his brother had had, the easy sociability, the enjoyment of occasion. It was a different kind, quiet and complete, and shown in the doing rather than the saying. Shown in standing in Tabor's grocery in the good coat. Shown in sitting in the corner of the long room while the tenant women had tea. Shown in the roses he had said nothing about. She had been right in February to say she had been afraid of the wrong thing. Management is doing things for a person according to what you have decided they need. Attention is noticing what is there and acting on the noticing, and then accepting whatever comes back. One of those things is about the person doing it. The other is about the person receiving it. She had had 11 years of the first kind, and she had learned to be very good at managing what that meant. She had, for as long as I observed her, received the second kind with a care and a gratitude and a growing ease that I found, each time I witnessed it, quietly extraordinary. That is the whole of the story. Or rather, that is the skeleton. The story is in all the things I have tried to give you, the paddock in December and the county archives in October, and the kitchen with the new range and the roses in the plain vase. The story is in the way he said, "I know what I have," to his papers without looking up, and the way she glanced at him across the long room in October when Mrs. Hadley said that the ones who do the thing that should be done are the ones worth knowing. It is in the Tuesdays. It is in the silence worn comfortably together in her study in February. It is in the way he came through the door of Tabor's grocery and the room changed. I am glad I was in all those rooms. I was 31 years old when I became a barrister, and I thought at the time that the important work of the profession was in the large cases, the contested inheritances, the broken contracts, the significant transfers of significant property. I have since come to believe that the important work is simpler and more common and does not often find its way into the law reports. It is the standing in a room when the law is being used for something you do not admire, and the doing of the thing that should be done when the moment arrives. It is the "what do we need to do?" rather than "is there any hope?" It is the going back to the original survey. It is the good coat and the Tuesday morning. I have been a barrister for 31 years. I have once been present for something that I will think about for the rest of them.